Thank you for mentioning that. Kathy had asked a question if anybody was on YouTube. I don't know if I switched this or somebody else, but we had accidentally been streaming to a different service besides YouTube. We'd been streaming to something else. So anyway, looks like we're on up and running on YouTube now, and hopefully all that
okay,
is...
she found it.
Okay,
my sister
good.
Was saying she couldn't find you on YouTube.
I'm sorry. Well, I appreciate you mentioning that because I wouldn't have known. I just looked quickly at where we were streaming, and I saw three venues, but one of them was actually another social media account that I think mainly the youth ministry watches. So if any of the teens were watching on this other platform, thanks for tuning in. Appreciate that. Okay, so between in this period known as the intertestamental period, Jewish persons didn't stop writing, they didn't stop thinking, they didn't stop reflecting on scripture and things like that. They had a very robust corpus of literature that came from this time period. Some of these things are works that stand in and of themselves. How many of you have heard the term the Maccabees before? Okay, a lot of us have heard of that name before. Okay, yeah, so there's a good work of Jewish history known as First Maccabees. It kind of sets the scene for a lot of it's actually pretty important for Jewish history. There's a lot of other things that happened during Jewish time. Have you ever noticed why the Old Testament never says a word about synagogues? And then when we come to the New Testament, synagogues are all over the place. Okay, yeah, that's a development in that 400-year period, and a pretty important one because, well, Jesus has sometimes a contentious relationship with synagogues. So anyway, Joy, glad that you could join us on Facebook. Thanks for tuning in. And so anyway, this thing that I want us to see tonight is a great example of how Jewish persons, especially in the intertestamental period, came to view and ridicule idols and the worship of idols. Now we see some of that in the Old Testament, but this story is one that you probably haven't seen before, or maybe it's been a while. This story is not in your Bible, but it is attributed to the prophet Daniel. Now, one thing that you might not know about is that the Old Testament was, over a period of a long time, translated at different times into Greek, from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. The Greek translation of the first 5 books of the Bible is pretty good. It's a pretty solid translation. They do a good job. Think about it like it's the equivalent of maybe like an ESV or like a New American Standard type translation. Okay, pretty firm. Sticks to the text pretty well. In some of the later books, some of the Greek translations aren't really translations so much as they're paraphrases, and they have all these other things that are added in. It's more like the Message, or like the Amplified Bible or something like that. What I want to read for us is one of these things that gets added to the book of Daniel. And you see here on the screen, this is Theodotion is the name of the person who did this translation. This book is called Bel, B-E-L, Bel and the Dragon. And it's an addition to the book of Daniel. So basically, we set the scene here in verse 1, and you can see this king died, and then Cyrus the Persian shows up, and Daniel is here. You can see here in verse 2, and then we'll start really in verse 3. The Babylonians had an idol named Bel, and each day they would bring all of this nice choice flour and 40 sheep and 6 measures of wine. And the king would revere this idol and go every day to do obeisance. That's just worship. But Daniel continued to worship God. The king said, "Why don't you worship Bel?" And so Daniel answered and said, "I don't revere idols made by hands, but the living God who created everything." The king was surprised, said, "You don't think Bel is a god? Don't you see how much he eats and drinks every day?" Okay, so this is what's going on. These priests to this idol called Bel, these priests will bring in this meal and set it up before Bel every night. And then every morning, all the food has been eaten. And the king takes this as a sign that Bel, this idol, is actually eating this food. I like this kind of stretches credulity, but that's part of the reason why this story isn't in the canon. Okay, this is a later edition, but anyway, we'll just keep rolling along with this. Daniel laughs at him, verse 7, and said, "Don't be deceived, O king, for this one is only clay inside and bronze outside. He has never eaten or drunk anything." So the king's upset and says, "If you don't tell me who's eating this provision, you shall die. But if you show that Bel is eating them, Daniel shall die, because he has spoken blasphemy against Bel." So Daniel said to the king, "Okay, sounds good." So verse 10, there were 70 priests of Bel, including the wives and children. And the king went with Daniel to the house of Bel, and the priests of Bel said, "Lo, we're now going outside. So you, O king, set out the food, place the wine. When you have mixed it, shut the door, and seal it with your signet. And when you return in the morning, if you do not find everything eaten by Bel, we will die, or Daniel, who is telling lies against us." Now they were contemptuous, for beneath the table they had made a hidden entrance, and they used to go through it regularly and consume the food. And it happened that as they had gone out, the king also set out the food for Bel. Daniel ordered his servants, and they brought ashes and threw the ashes all around the floor in the presence of the king alone. All right, so Daniel is going to catch these guys in their trick, basically. Daniel, unbeknownst to these priests and their families, Daniel's followers, his servants, put ashes on the floor, basically to catch the footprints. So as they went out, they shut the door, sealed it with a king's signet, and departed. The priests, verse 15, the priests came during the night according to their custom, and their wives and children, and they ate and drank everything. Like, this is really fun. I feel like quoting Gladiator. Are you not entertained? Right? Like, this is really fun. So verse 16, and the king readied early in the morning, and Daniel with him. And he said, "Are the seals unbroken, Daniel?" And he said, "And they are unbroken, O king." And it happened as soon as the doors opened, when the king looked at the table, he shouted in a loud voice, "You are great, O Bel, and there is no deceit in you, not one." And Daniel laughed again and restrained the king. He basically held the king back so he wouldn't go inside and step on the ashes that they very neatly laid down, and said, "Look now at the floor and notice whose footprints these are." And the king said, you can just imagine, "I see footprints of men and women and children." And enraged, the king then arrested the priests and their wives and children. And they showed him the hidden doors through which they used to enter and consume what was on the table. And the king killed them and gave Bel entirely over to Daniel, and he destroyed him and his temple. This is just a fun story. This is so much fun. Now, here's the reason why these kinds of stories were so popular in basically as Jewish folk tales, right? Like, I think that's a good way to think about it. These stories, yeah, Cheryl's right. Cheryl mentioned here, I'm having a great time. This stuff is great because it's the kinds of like warm, folksy tales that people would tell about their heroes that that illustrate while the story itself is fictitious, or it really seems fictitious. The story itself points to a much larger truth, kind of like a parable, right? I mean, Jesus's parables are not intended to be, news reports of people that he's heard about. They're intended to be stories that tell a particular point. This is a very common Jewish way of making a point, especially during this time period. And so they, the major point here that the story of Daniel and Bel is about is the foolishness, the lengths to which people will go in order to deceive others and prove to them that idols are actually true. And this common way of ridiculing idols is, it's a theme that runs, especially throughout the later Old Testament and into the New Testament as well. Turn with me to Acts chapter 19. Turn to Acts chapter 19 really quickly. We'll see some Easter Bell. Easter Bell likes this story to Santa Claus eating the cookies. Don't tell your kids or grandkids that, okay? But it's a great story. So turn to Acts chapter 19. And we'll look at, let's see, let me find the right verse that we need to get to. Okay, so let's turn to verse 23. And let's talk a little bit about how the influence of Christianity always directly and negatively affects the influence of paganism. Scripture has shown this, and other historical reports have shown this to be the case as well. So Acts chapter 19, verse 23, after Paul has been in Ephesus for a while, and there has Christianity has grown a little bit. Luke says this: now about that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. Now remember, followers of Jesus originally were called followers of the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis. Artemis was a common goddess especially in Ephesus. Brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but almost in all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger, not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificent, she whom all Asia and the world worship. All right. Once again, this is, there's evidence here that pagan temples suffered, as the gospel grew, pagan temples suffered economic consequences. Okay. This is Luke writing about Paul's travels. Paul would have been in Ephesus sometime in the 40s or 50s. Okay. So not very long after Paul's conversion in the grand scheme of things. Next, I want to show you something that you might also be familiar with. Give me just a sec. Let me find this. All right, give me just a second. I think what I'm looking for, I need to pull up real quick. I apologize. I had it up earlier than I might have accidentally closed it out. Okay, here we go. The next thing that I want to show you is something that comes really a generation later, just about, from a source that you might not expect. This is from a pagan. This is from a governor of the area known as Pontus and Bithynia, which is northern part of Turkey, a guy by the name of Pliny the Younger, and I can type his name here, Pliny, Pliny the Younger. There's a Pliny the Elder who is his uncle, I think. So this is a pagan. This guy's a pagan, right? Not a Christian sympathizer, but he has written to the Roman Emperor Trajan in around 110 to kind of 112 AD. Okay, so early second century. And a lot of the material that we've been looking at has come from the early second century. So Didache, first Clement, late first, early second century. So here is what Pliny has to say. I'll show you this. And I'll just read highlights of this. This is from his letters. And take a look at this. I'll zoom in so we can kind of get this. This is from his letters. If you go to book 10, letter 96. So Pliny's writing to Emperor Trajan. It's my practice, my lord, to refer to you to all matters concerning which I'm in doubt. Who can give better guidance than you? I've never participated in the trial of Christians. Okay, so this is a Roman pagan governor talking about Christians who have come to trial. And he doesn't know what is customary to deal with them. And he doesn't know if he should make any kind of distinction between male or female, slave or free, old or young. Anyway, so second paragraph here. It says, meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I've observed the following procedure. So he's asking about what's the proper procedure, what's proper punishment. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Interesting, right? We don't see Paul executed in a backwater province anywhere. Paul, as a Roman citizen, is allowed to appeal to Caesar and is therefore able to be transferred to Rome. This is the same kind of thing. All right, so we can continue on to these green highlighted sections here, really what we want to focus on. Some of these accusations continue to spread. And oh, goodness, this is the best one here. It says, an anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. Those who deny that they were or had been Christians, pay close attention to what Pliny has them do. When they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, meaning to an idol of the emperor, which I had ordered to be brought for the purpose, together with statues of the gods. So he brings in other statues. And if these persons who were accused, if they prayed, offered incense and wine, and invoked the gods and cursed Christ. And he says here, none of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. These I thought should be discharged. But the people who were unwilling to do this, he had executed. He had to, he also mentions that he got a little bit more information from some folks. He said that the sum and substance of the Fulton heir had been accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn, sing to Christ as to a god, bind themselves to basically live moral lives, and then they would come back and eat together, but it wasn't weird food, it was just normal food. But then eventually they had stopped doing that because Pliny had forbidden political associations. Now, the reason why that's important that he mentions political associations here is that's how a lot of people who were not Christians, who were not even Jews at the time, how a lot of pagans would have viewed Christian meetings. They would have viewed them as some kind of club or association. Those were wildly popular in the ancient world. We have inscription after inscription of bylaws and lists of members and everything. Really, one of the most popular ones was basically a burial club. If you came to regular meetings, if you paid your monthly dues, you could ensure that you would get a decent and respectable burial, which is an important thing for Jews and pagans. So anyway, Pliny goes on to say, the matter seemed to me to warrant consulting you, especially because so many people were involved in this. For many persons of every age, every rank, and also both sexes are and will be endangered, for the contagion of this superstition, talking about Christianity, has spread not only to the cities, but also the villages and farms. But it seems possible to check and cure it. It is certainly quite clear that the temples, which had been almost deserted, had begun to be frequented, that the established religious rites, long neglected, are being resumed, and that from everywhere sacrificial animals are coming, from which until now very few purchasers can be found. Notice what we saw in the story about Bel, Daniel and Bel. The temple was destroyed. Notice what we saw, this one Demetrius in Acts 19, talk about how nobody was coming to the temples anymore. Look at what Pliny says about the temples here in his part of the world. Nobody was coming. When the gospel is spread, or when people are following God's law, these kinds of places just end up dying. They end up dying out. And so with that, we can turn to the Epistle of Diognetus, and I will pull this up for us on the screen, and we will work through some of this. So what we have now is this section here. Whoever the author is says, I see that you are extremely interested in learning about the religion of the Christians and are asking very clear and careful questions about them, specifically what God they believe in and how they worship him, so that they all disregard the world and despise death, neither recognizing those who are considered to be gods by the Greeks, nor observing the superstition of the Jews. And he goes on to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit of detail. We're going to look at the first couple of chapters of this, just to kind of show you a little bit about how, again, this how one early and pretty eloquent Christian talks about these kinds of worship, these kinds of distinctions in Christian worship, and what really pagans and Jews would have done. And what I want us to see is that there is a consistent theme. There's a consistent theme that runs through here. And it's fascinating to see how, see this particular take on how Christians stand out in parts of Scripture, and how Christians throughout history have stood out from their culture, and how in some ways they have been very much a part of their culture. So let's take a look here at chapter 2. I've got this pulled up for us. So he's talking about idols, and he says, come, clear your mind of its prejudices, cast aside the customs that deceive you, become a new person. He talks to the second sentence there in verse 1, see not only with your eyes, but also your intellect, what substance or what form those happen to have whom you call and regard as gods. Is not one of them stone like that upon which we walk, and another bronze no better than the utensils that have been forged for our use, and another wood already rotted away, and another silver which needs a watchman to guard it lest it be stolen, and another iron, he's talking about idols here, corroded by rust, and another pottery not a bit more attractive than that made for the most unmentionable use. He's like, you make your gods out of the same kind of stuff that you would basically use for a bedpan, right? Right? Sorry, I didn't mean to. There we go. Well, no, come back. Yeah, he's saying like you make your idol statues out of stuff that we would use for bedpans. Verse 3. Aren't all of these perishable? Aren't they forged by iron and fire? Didn't the sculptor make them? He continues to go on. I love what he says here in verse 4. Again, could not these things that are now worshipped by you be made by human hands into utensils like the rest? Are they not all deaf and blind, without souls, without feelings, without movements? Do they not all rot? Do they not all decay? These are the things you call gods. You serve them, you worship them, and in the end, you become like them. Wow. Man, what a line, right? What a line.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, the irony of idol worship is not lost on any Jewish thinker or Christian thinker in this time period. The irony that you worship these false gods and you become like them. Yeah. So he goes on to say,
Kevin, isn't that in Scripture, that just that part? Those who make them are like them.
I want to say Habakkuk chapter 2 has some discussion like that. I also want to say Isaiah chapter 40 or chapter 44. I forget off the top of my head. This is something that I think we have looked at before in this class. But I think Habakkuk chapter 2 has some discussion of that. I forget precisely where in Habakkuk, but yeah, check Habakkuk chapter 2. Joe, your comment here, I like Thunder Jar. Is that from the PDF that I gave? No. Okay. Is that just your own nomenclature?
Yeah, that's what they call them in East Texas. The thunder jar.
Man, I'm so sorry I mentioned that. Oh man. You can use your imagination. Moving on. So I love what he says here. And he goes on to talk about how, you think you're giving these statues honor, but have you noticed this? You actually dishonor your own statues. The simple ones that are made of clay and wood, you don't treat those special. And then you have to protect the ones that are made out of gold and silver because you're afraid somebody's going to come steal them. What God is afraid of being stolen? These are not gods, and you worship them as gods. It's absolutely foolish. And so he kind of summarizes the typical Christian apologetic against idol worship. Common utensils are made of the same stuff. What power does a statue have that's made by hands? And you become mute, deaf, and blind, just like the idols you worship. I love this line, verses 4 and 5 here. Lines 4 and 5. These are the things you call gods. You serve them, you worship them, and in the end you become like them. Oh, wow. Man, that stings hard. No harder than John the Baptist calling Pharisees a brood of vipers, right? Yeah. If you really want to get under, I'm in church leadership. I have been for 6 or 7 years now. If you really want to get under your church leadership skin, call them something like a brood of vipers or just some other mean and nasty thing like that. I'm not giving you any hints, right? Okay. So Manette, if Richard is listening, okay, I'm not saying that you should try that. But anyway, this is common stock. This is the common stuff of Christian polemic. If you know the word polemical or polemics, a Christian argument against idol worship. Well, let's continue on to chapter 3 here, because he switches gears and shifts away from idol worship and transitions to some polemic against Jewish worship. So I'll go ahead and share the screen as well so you can see that, or you're welcome to follow along in the PDF. Epistle Diognetus, chapter 3. He says, and next, I suppose that you're especially anxious to hear why Christians do not worship in the same way as the Jews. The Jews, indeed, insofar as they abstain from the kind of worship described above, rightly claim to worship the one God of the universe and to think of him as master. But insofar as they offer this worship to him in the same way as those already described, they're altogether mistaken. So he's talking about bringing sacrifices to God. For whereas the Greeks provide an example of their stupidity by offering things to senseless and deaf images, the Jews, thinking that they are offering these things to God as if he were in need of them, could rightly consider it folly rather than worship. The key here is really verse 5, which I'm going to skip down to. This is probably an uncharitable description of Jewish worship. Okay? But this is, again, this is part of the point of this class, is to see kind of what these folks are thinking. So it says here in verse 5, in any case, those who imagine that they are offering sacrifices to him by means of blood and fat and whole burnt offerings and are honoring him with these tokens of respect do not seem to me to be the least bit different from those who show the same respect to deaf images. The latter, meaning pagans, make offerings to things unable to receive the honor, while the former, meaning Jews, think they are offering something to the one who is in need of nothing. So this is an early this is an early Christian polemic or an early Christian apologetic against Jewish forms of worship. It was common amongst many Christian apologists, especially in the later centuries, to talk about, really to look, to cast aspersions on Jewish worship, particularly because in their minds, Jesus had fulfilled all of that. It was no longer necessary. That had been fulfilled. So, if you have a Jewish friend or coworker and you're wanting to share Christ with them, I recommend you take a different route, at least initially, right? Maybe don't go this route with them. You can talk about how Cheryl's asked a question. So when did Jews stop offering sacrifices when the temple was destroyed? When the temple was destroyed, there was no longer a place for them to take sacrifices. There's a lot of hope in some Jewish groups these days that the Temple Mount will be cleansed. Think what that really means and implies, right? That whole area is going to need to be leveled of what's on top of it. There's a lot of hope from some Jewish groups that the Temple Mount will be cleansed and they will begin to offer sacrifices again. Joe, what's your question here?
I just wondered if anybody but me has ever seen the old clawfoot bathtub buried in the front yard with a Mary inside. It's like a bathtub grotto, with the plaster Mary inside.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen that.
It's a creative use of a clawfoot bathtub.
Gotcha. Cheryl says that means the temple was gone when this was written. Cheryl, I'm confident that the temple was probably gone when this was written. But that does raise questions because, wouldn't they have stopped offering these sacrifices then? I had mentioned earlier that people are not sure, scholars are not sure exactly when the Epistle to Diognetus was written. And so it's possible that he is speaking about this in the present tense as just kind of a conventional way of describing it. Or it's possible that it is still going on and this was written before the destruction of the temple. It's hard to nail down. It's another reason why this Epistle to Diognetus is so mysterious is it is not referred to by hardly any medieval writers or author or medieval writers or scholars. They just don't seem to refer to this. It's almost as if they just didn't know about it, which is kind of wild. So, Connie, thank you. Connie's mentioned also in the chat, Psalm 115 says those who worship idols become like them. Yeah, so this is a common idea in Jewish and Christian thought. Let's turn over one more. Let's look at one more chapter, or two more things in the Epistle to Diognetus. The author moves from talking about Jewish worship to specifically referring to Jewish customs. Okay. And so, right at the outfront here, outset, I think it's important to mention that this is another maybe uncharitable characterization of certain Jewish customs, but again, this is how a lot of people thought during this time. So let's take a look at this. But with regard to their qualms about meats and superstition concerning the Sabbath and pride and circumcision and hypocrisy about fasting and new moons, I doubt that you need to learn from me that they are ridiculous and not worth discussing. And so he asks, for is it not unlawful to accept some of the things created by God for human use as created good, but to refuse others as useless and superfluous? And is it not impious to slander God by alleging that he forbids us to do any good thing on the Sabbath day? Now, this is a big deal because Jesus actually deals with some of this. One of Jesus's harshest sayings to his opponents comes because he heals someone on the Sabbath. Jesus has the audacity to do something good on the Sabbath. I think Matthew chapter 12, Luke chapter 11 is where you can find that discussion. Jesus is pushing back against a vision of the Sabbath that God never intended. And this author is picking up on that without quoting any of the Gospels, right? Without quoting Matthew or Luke, without quoting any other discussion about doing good on the Sabbath. He strikes right at the heart of this discussion that we see Jesus having here in these two chapters in Matthew and Luke. So then go back to this. He burns on them for verse 4, and is it not also ridiculous to take pride in the mutilation of the flesh as a sign of election, as though they were specially beloved by God because of this? Meaning, circumcision does not endear you to God. Well, Paul makes a point like that. Paul makes a similar point. It isn't, Abraham was selected. Abraham was considered righteous, not because he was circumcised, but because he believed, he was faithful. He was, he had his allegiance. I'm trying to come up with synonyms for faith and faithfulness. He had his allegiance in God. He was faithful. He had fidelity towards God. That is, according to Paul in Galatians, that's what Abraham's faith, that's what his righteousness was rooted in, his faithfulness. Not the fact that he was circumcised, because he was considered righteous before he was even circumcised. So this uncircumcised person was considered faithful. And Paul goes on to talk a lot about that. But again, this author, Epistle of Diognetus here, right here in verse 4, if you can see the section that I've highlighted, he doesn't cite Paul, like he doesn't quote Paul, he doesn't refer to Paul. He just states matter-of-factly. And so it's interesting that, is this guy aware? I mean, surely he's aware of Jesus and Paul, but he doesn't feel a need to quote them. And so he goes on to continue thinking about these kinds of things. And like I said, kind of an uncharitable characterization of Jewish customs. But anyway, one of the it's important to mention that there was probably the greatest thing that held people back from becoming full converts to Judaism was circumcision. And whether you were male or not, the idea of some degree of self-mutilation in order to show your devotion to your God was repulsive to a lot of folks, especially in the ancient world. So these were some common apologetics where a Christian would say, okay, look at these things about idol worship, look at these things about Jewish worship and Jewish customs. And and basically what we see here is these folks saying, look, Christians, on the other hand, are radically different. Christians, on the other hand, are radically different. And this is where we're going to get to really some of my favorite stuff here in this letter. I'll open this up. Diognetus chapter 5 has some really, really neat things. And I'd love to hear y'all's reflections on this as we get here to the end of this, after we wrap this up. He says, for Christians are not distinguished from the rest of humanity by country, language, or custom, for nowhere do they live in cities of their own, nor do they speak some unusual dialect, nor do they practice an eccentric way of life. This teaching of theirs has not been discovered by the thought and reflection of ingenious people, nor do they promote any human doctrine as some do. But while they live in both Greek and barbarian cities, as each one's lot was cast, and follow the local customs in dress and food and other aspects of life, at the same time, they demonstrate the remarkable and admittedly unusual character of their own citizenship. They live in their own countries, but only as non-residents. They participate in everything as citizens and endure everything as foreigners. Every foreign country is their fatherland, and every fatherland is foreign. They marry like everyone else and have children, but they do not expose their offspring. They share their food, but not their wives. They are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. They live on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws. Indeed, they're in their private lives, they transcend the laws. They love everyone, and by everyone, they are persecuted. And we could go on with the rest of that chapter, but I think you get the idea. That's actually really good. I really like that. Man, like there's some good stuff in there. Like you could almost preach that, right? And somebody might think, yeah, that's in the Bible somewhere. It's not, at least not worded like that. Let me get your thoughts on that. Was there anything in there that struck you? Anything that you thought was especially meaningful? What do you think?
I really love the citizen of heaven.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
We are, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, he says there, they live on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven.
Yeah. And because we live in Texas, we're just a little bit closer to heaven than most people.
I've heard Tennesseans say the same thing about Tennessee. Mostly me and Mark, but okay. Yeah. What do you think about this line? This is kind of strange. Well, it implies that some people are up to strange things. They share their food, but not their wives. Yikes. There was no limit. It's not a stretch. I know children might be listening because Linnea's still on. So unless she has her headphones in. It's not a stretch at all to say that as perverse and like as sexually perverse as you may think our world is, and I mean, yeah, it is. The ancient world was no less perverse. The ancient world was no less corrupt. And they didn't have laws against indecency and the stuff you could put on billboards and things like that. They didn't have any of that, any of those kinds of laws.
I thought it was really neat the way it was so precise and concise as to how he described the morals. And that was just, didn't waste any words. It was very direct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Didn't they say something about a strange lifestyle? Or
He said it wasn't a strange lifestyle.
Here in verse 4, Joe, it says, but while they live in both Greek and barbarian cities, as each one's lot was cast, and follow the local customs and dress and food and other aspects of life, at the same time, they demonstrate the remarkable and admittedly unusual character of their own citizenship.
Okay. So it makes you kind of wonder about Amish, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, next time we run into an Amish person, you can ask him. Connie's pointed out in the chat some overlap with some stuff later in this chapter, and some things that Paul says in 2 Corinthians. Oh yeah, Kathy, I forgot that y'all lived in Pennsylvania for a while. Yeah, so you would. There were Amish communities not too far away from where we lived in central Kentucky.
There's a community in Beeville, and they bring their produce to the farmers market every week.
Cool. It was not fun waiting to pass the horse and buggy on a 2-lane road winding around the hills of central Kentucky. Because I wanted to be respectful, right? Like they're just in a horse and buggy. I didn't want to go zipping around them, but like I also did need to get around them. So Christians, according to the Epistle to Diognetus, are in some ways alike and in some ways unlike their neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a great passage to reflect on. Yeah, there's a lot we could do with this passage, just kind of unpacking this. I think the general sense of everybody is that last section there in chapter 5 is pretty good. and really something worth chewing on. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll look at some of the rest of the Epistle to Diognetus next week. That is going to be September 12th. And then on September 19th, Sunday, September 19th, and Sunday, September 26th, we're going to take just a short break. We'll be off just those 2 weeks. Let everybody kind of get refreshed and relaxed. I've got, we're getting our new classes for Q4, October, November, and December. We're getting those prepared and up and running. And I'm going to be out of town on the 26th. So we'll take off just a couple of weeks from this class. Would y'all believe that we started this last September? Kathy's face is like, no, we didn't. Yes, we did. We started this streaming class last September because we were interested in getting another class option up and running, and we've been going strong ever since. I think we've probably met. We've taken a few weeks off here and there, so we've probably met maybe 40 to 45 times. And most of y'all have been here through every single one of those times. I really appreciate that. We have some relative newcomers too, Don. Appreciate you tuning in. Folks on YouTube and Facebook, thank y'all so much for joining in tonight. We're going to wrap up here. Joe has asked me about a spoiler alert on the new classes. Joe, I had half a mind to say yes and then click end meeting and just let you leave you hanging there. I'm going to be teaching a new class in Q4, October, November, and December. Kind of some Bible basics, but we'll talk about some things. One week that we'll look at is some stuff on like what exactly does inspiration look like? If we say scripture's inspired, what does that look like? We'll spend a week, maybe two. We'll spend a week on that, some other stuff. If you've been to church for a long time, this will be some review, but you might find some things that you maybe hadn't thought about. So we'll do a class on that. And Don has graciously agreed to teach a class for us. And then I'm working on one more class, trying to find the right teacher for that. Hoping that can pan out, but we will see. But we'll have our usual 3 Sunday morning classes, and we'll continue going along. So, everybody, thank y'all very much. Appreciate it. Y'all have a good evening, and we will see you next Sunday night, and then we'll be off for 2 weeks.